Hello, and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am joined by Luke, Elliott, and James Bailey from the Ink to Film podcast and YouTube channel. So thank you guys so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, good to see you, Laura. Thanks for bringing us on.
Yeah, and today we are talking about Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, published in 2014, and comparing it with the Alex Garland movie from 2018. Annihilation is one that I covered in 2021, back when I just had a podcast, but then Ink to Film also covered this back when the movie came out. So I will be linking to all of those down below. And if you guys just want to share a little bit about your channel.
Sure. We have been covering book to film adaptations since 2017. Annihilation was an early project for us. I think it came in 2018. And I went back and listened to some of our coverage. I went back and read this book again for this episode. And I've seen this movie very recently because I was at a convention called NorwestCon where I did a presentation. And this was one of the films I talked about. So all of this is now fresh to me, and I definitely have a lot of evolving opinions about it, and things have changed over the 5, 6, 7 years, however many it's been since we covered it. So yeah, really excited to get into this one. I do recommend people check out those episodes if they want to see what our very early reactions are to it. Yeah, again, also it has changed a little bit over time.
Yeah, Luke is a writer and I'm a filmmaker, so we like to talk craft on our podcast a lot. And ultimately, we loved this adaptation, and we referenced it quite a few times over the years, but we covered it back in 2018. So getting the chance to come on and talk to you about it, Laura, this is such a blast from the past and such a joy. And again, it's one that we reference frequently and say, man, this is such a cool one because of source material and eventual adaptation being quite different, but both having strong merits.
Yeah, definitely. This is one of those type of adaptations I love to talk about. And I think fans of the book still like the movie, even though it is so different, though, in so many ways. So yeah, we definitely have a lot to talk about here. So to get into the book, I am going to begin with just an overview of what happens in the book for those who have not yet read it. That way you won't be lost in the book discussion section of this video. I would highly recommend the book though, so if you haven't read it, you definitely should. It is very short, but it is fantastic. But for those who haven't read it and don't plan on reading it, here is the basic gist. We have an expedition of women who are sent into what is called Area X, and it is this area of land that has been overtaken by some unknown force and has changed the land. And we don't know any of these women's names, but the story is narrated by the biologist. And before going into Area X, when they were in training at the Southern Reach, they were told that the lighthouse would be their focus because this land that has been overtaken is on the coast where there is a lighthouse. However, once they are in Area X, a few days in, they find this tunnel going into the ground. And even though it's going down into the ground, the biologist can't help but think of it as a tower. And this tower was not mentioned in their training. It doesn't show up on any maps. And so it seems very odd that suddenly they come across this tunnel, and the psychologist, who is the leader of this group, it seems like she now wants the tunnel to be the focus of their research. And when they go down into the tower, there are words being written on the walls, and the words are made of a natural substance, like some kind of spore. And the biologist leans in close to look at it when one of them sprays her in her face, and she is infected by these spores. And they all went into Area X knowing that the psychologist who worked for the Southern Reach, whereas these other women were all recruited onto this expedition, but the psychologist had worked at the Southern Reach, and they knew that she was going to be using hypnotism on them to some extent. But after the biologist is infected with the spores, she realizes how often they were actually being hypnotized and being told what to feel and what to see and what to think. And the biologist is now immune to the hypnotism, but she is playing along. That way the psychologist won't know that she has changed thanks to being infected by Area X. And so they have this first trip down into the tower, and then they go back to base camp, and the next morning, the anthropologist in the group is gone. And the psychologist lies to them, saying that she just decided to leave. But the truth is, the psychologist, during the night, hypnotized the anthropologist to go back down into the tower because there is this creature that is writing the words on the wall. And so she had the anthropologist go down close to get a sample of this creature. However, the creature ended up killing the anthropologist. But before they realized this is what happened, the surveyor and the biologist decide to go back to the tower tower, and the psychologist says that she will wait up top for them. And so the biologist and the surveyor go down below, and this is when they see the anthropologist's dead body. And then when they get back up onto the surface, the psychologist has left. And from here, the surveyor and the biologist choose to part ways because the biologist wants to go check out the lighthouse, whereas the surveyor just wants to go back to base camp. And so the biologist goes to the lighthouse, and when she is there, she sees like an insane stack of journals because everyone in expeditions are given these journals to write in. And she sees like hundreds upon hundreds, like maybe even thousands of these. And so she realizes that they were told they were the 12th expedition, but clearly there have been hundreds of expeditions, and Area X in the book has been around for 30 years. So over the 30 years, there have just been so many more people going into this area than the Southern Reach admitted. And so she does read some of these journals, and she also finds her husband's journal because, I forgot to mention, her husband was in the 11th expedition, and he and the other members had returned home, but they were just a shell of themselves, and so they were taken back to the Southern Reach, where then they all got cancer and died. And so in part, it's because her husband had been in Area X, and that's why she wants to go, but she also just wants to see it for herself. And so she sees her husband's journal, and she isn't ready to read it yet, but she does take it and put it in her backpack. And then she sees the psychologist, and the psychologist had jumped from the top of the lighthouse and now is laying outside. And so the biologist goes to talk to her, and the psychologist tries to use hypnotism. She uses a trigger word of annihilation, which is supposed to cause the person who is hypnotized to commit suicide. But the biologist is immune to the hypnotism, and so she doesn't do that, obviously. And from here, she and the psychologist talk some, and the psychologist admits that the Southern Reach did lie to this expedition to a certain extent about Area X and what they knew about it. And the psychologist also says that she can see that the biologist has changed. And we also hear other parts that biologist, like her skin is glowing. Like she walks around at night and she doesn't need a flashlight because her skin glows. But eventually the psychologist does die. And so then the biologist goes back to base camp, where then she and the surveyor have like a face off because neither of them trust each other. And the surveyor can also see that the biologist looks physically different, and so she doesn't trust her. And so the biologist feels like she has no choice but to kill the surveyor. And there's a funny moment when she is putting the surveyor's body out to sea, and before she lets it go, she wants to like pay her last respects. And so she says something about how like, you know, I forgive you for shooting at me and trying to kill me, and I hope you forgive me for having to kill you in this situation. But then it's funny because she's like, I don't know how much that means, because I know if the surveyor was brought back to life, neither of us would forgive anything. But anyway, from here she decides she wants to go back to the tower and see what she calls the crawler, which is the thing writing the words. And so she goes down into the tunnel and she comes face to face with this crawler, which is just this undescribable entity. And it kind of captures her in a way, and she keeps blacking out and she feels like she's drowning, and it seems to just go on forever before eventually she is released by its grasp, its hold on her. And then she makes her way down to the bottom of the tower. And then when she comes back up though to leave, she's able to pass the crawler and it does nothing to her. So it seems that she has passed the test, kind of a thing, and she was able to live. And when she looks at the crawler in this moment, she sees within it the face of the lighthouse keeper, who had been the lighthouse keeper when this area was taken over by whatever Area X is. And so then she goes back up to the top, and at this point she has been reading from her husband's journals, and we do find out that the crawler, or Area X, it does create doppelgangers, though we find out that it was his replica who had returned home, not the real version. And in the journal, he writes that he is going to sail out to sea. And so from here, the biologist decides that she is going to follow in her husband's footsteps, and she leaves her journal amongst the pile of other journals in the lighthouse, and that is the end. So part of me, I don't know if we should start first with the biologist or with Area X. The biologist, I just find her so fascinating, like just as fascinating as Area X in so many ways. And something I loved about this book is, even though it is, you know, like this sci-fi horror novel and there's so many weird things going on, the heart of the story in my mind is the biologist and the relationship with her husband. And when the book starts, her husband is dead, right? And yet we see the changes with the relationship she has with her her husband as she gets to know him by being in Area X, but also by reading his journal, of course. And so, yeah, I just loved those aspects, and just hearing about the relationship in certain parts of it just really resonated with me. And like, it's a very human part of the story, even though the story itself is so weird in this sci-fi book. And then the biologist herself too, like, she's such a great fit for Area X because she is so unique. And there's an interesting part where before they go into Area X, the psychologist, she interviews all of these people, and the biologist can tell that the way the biologist is responding, the psychologist doesn't like her. And yet at the same time, the very reasons the psychologist doesn't like the biologist is also why the biologist is a perfect fit for this expedition. So yeah, I just want to hear what some of your thoughts are on the biologist as a person, but also any thoughts you have on the relationship with her husband.
I'll jump in. I agree. Like, this relationship is so interesting, and it's pretty different, even though there's some overlap, right? Venn diagram, some overlap between the two. But I found the biologist in the book to be this really interesting, like, independent person whose main struggles with her relationship with her husband are around her sort of fascination with nature and her call to biology and her call to her, I guess, her job, but also just her, like, life passion of, like, understanding the natural world. And in some ways, like, that's how she's cheating on him, which is changed in the movie. And because of that, like, and we don't even find out that I don't think we find out that she's married, or we definitely don't find out much about it until, like, midway through the book. Like, it's more of a slow reveal in the book. And it really establishes her as, like, her own person who's drawn to Area X for her own reasons. But I agree that, like, that sort of relationship where she's independent from her husband is brought into focus as she starts to learn about him through this notebook she finds later. And they start living this sort of parallel experience in Area X. And it seems almost like she starts to fall in love with him in a way that she wasn't before because of the way he interacted with Area X. I don't know, that's also cool. And, like, reading the book again for the second time, I had forgotten that, like, we are in Area X from the jump. And I think in the very first chapter, she gets hit in the face with spores. So not only are we in Area X, but, like, Area X is in her. Because of that, everything feels so unreliable and uncanny and weird and off, and you never get a sense like you're grounded in normal reality. And then again, that's something that the movie definitely has a different approach with, where we're kind of like starting in the real world and then traveling into Area X, and there's this whole, like, down the rabbit hole. We discovered Alice in Wonderland on our show, but there's this kind of journey into the uncanny, which is a little different than, like, being immersed in it from the jump to where you never feel moored in reality. It has some really interesting consequences and effects throughout the narrative, but I just found, like, a whole new love and appreciation for reading this book again. So thank you for giving me a chance to read it again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember loving this book when we read it originally. I like Jeff Vandermeer as a writer and as a human being in general. Like, he's I like to talk a lot about, like, Florida. There's the politics in Florida that are very divisive, but the ecological area of Florida, there's so much biodiversity and there's so many cool areas. Like, there's the natural springs that stay, like, 70 degrees even when it's 90 to 100 degrees outside, and we have, like, alligators that are basically dinosaurs, and a lot of these things are brought into the story. And seeing Jeff Vandermeer, like, represent Florida in a really cool and fascinating way, and kind of making a story about, nature in a sense, but it's also, like, how evolution and nature and like just the brutality and beauty in the same stroke, he highlights those in this story. So in getting to the biologist, I think it's so interesting on this read that I realize she feels very removed at the beginning of the story, and as we get more and more into the unknown in this crazy journey that she goes on, we start to see more of her humanity, whereas the early chapters sort of feel sparse and, like, almost like militaristic, and like this is a mission that they're on, and they're keeping their cool. But as things start to unravel, we also see, like, the humanity and, like, the nature of humanity within this, like, evolving landscape of all of that. And man, this book is so weird in the best way, and still to this day I think it's one of my favorite books we've read for Ink to Film podcast.
I think it's one of my favorite books I've ever read. It's up there, and especially in this reread, I'm realizing that it is quickly rising the ranks.
Yeah,
I totally agree. And after I read this book for the first time, this is my Jeff Vandermeer shelf. So I haven't read all of his books, but, like, the Ambergris series and the Southern Reach. And then also he has the fourth book in the Southern Reach is being released later this year. So I am so excited because the third book, he released them very close together. So it's been a while. So the fact that he's releasing a fourth one is kind of a surprise. But yeah, so Jeff Vandermeer is such a fantastic writer. And yeah, he always creates such bizarre worlds. And especially when I read this the first time, I had never read anything anything like this. And so it like blew my mind. And since then I have read maybe other like these weird horror, nature horror type books. I've read more of those since, but yeah, his are still some of my favorite. And yeah, with Area X, the way the creatures in Area X, the animals, they all used to be humans who were part of the expedition or who had lived here before this force invaded. And so that part too is just so creepy and unsettling. Like when she sees a dolphin or something and it has like the eye of a human, but it's before she realizes what's happening. So she's just like that was weird. And then of course the creature in the reeds, and yeah, it was just so creepy. But also before we get into, you know, the tower and the crawler, of course, I also wanted to share a quote about the biologist, which you kind of touched on, but how like with science, it's about observing in a lot of ways. And when you're not part of it and just seeing it from the outside, but there's a quote how she says, "I had gotten sidetracked like I always did because I melted into my surroundings, could not remain separate from, apart from, objectivity, a foreign land to me." And so how even before Area X, like it was impossible for her to not disrupt whatever she was studying because she just couldn't help herself and she would become part of it. And how that happens in Area X, right? Like she gets the spore in her face, but then very early on, like she just embraces Area X. There's one more quote I want to read about this, and this is from after she has talked with the psychologist. But the quote reads, "The terrible thing, the thought I cannot dislodge after all I have seen, is that I can no longer say with conviction that this is a bad thing," meaning Area X and what's happening there. "Not when looking at the pristine nature of Area X and then the world beyond which we have altered so much. Before she died, the psychologist said I had changed, and I think she meant I had changed sides. It isn't true. I don't know if there even are sides or what that might mean, but it could be true. I see now that I could be persuaded. A religious or superstitious person, someone who believed in angels or demons, might see it differently. Almost anyone else might see it differently, but I am not those people. I am just the biologist. I don't require any of this to have a deeper meaning. I am aware that all of this speculation is incomplete, inexact, inaccurate, useless. If I don't have real answers, it is because we still don't know what questions to ask. Our instruments are useless, our mythology broken, our motivations selfish."
That quote, I think, perfectly shows how this book achieves a level that I think is honestly genius in its ability to hint at and allude to this greater truth that is ungraspable by the author, by the reader, by the biologist, maybe even unknowable to everyone. And yet the unknowable is so hard to write about. And Vandermeer finds a way to do it. And one of the ways he can do it is with like sticking to this perspective of this woman who recognizes her own place in the natural world and is ready to sort of accept that Area X is drawing her in and assimilating in a way and like making her a part of this space, because she always feels that way, even when she's just studying this like, you know, empty lot next to her house. And so she's like primed to accept this sort of Area X perspective. And because of that, we don't know, is this how she would have felt always, or is this Area X in her mind? Because we also know, as we said, like it got in there in the first chapter, and she definitely is changing throughout, and her like attitudes towards herself and towards what's happening are shifting throughout. So we know that those spores are like in her brain, and that's such a creepy thought. And like I always love that like the prose itself, the character itself is able to show that progression, and that's why I think this is such a fantastic piece of work. And like the book is so short, and yet it feels so massive. Like I'm always so surprised when I go back to it how short this book is, and yet it hints at so many things, and the Area X feels impossibly huge. Yeah, I think all of that is represented in that quote, so I love that.
Yeah, and the idea of having a biologist be the person going in to study this is like this person's predisposed to be inquisitive, to be interested in what's going to happen. And then you take a character who, as we learn throughout the course of the novel, has gone through something that's changed her world and basically, in some sense, possibly ended her life as it was before. So she's seeking evolution. She's seeking some sense of like how to proceed. So she goes into this. And I think that this, we can get into this some with the film more, but there's like a bit of like self-destruction that's going into some that being on a mission in this sort of a scenario represents, and how she, over the course of it, she's affected by the spores. And then you can decide for yourself as the reader, is that the spores influence on her, or is it that she was always, because of her situation in life and the fact that she's in this Area X now, is she just so fascinated and in love with nature and so like inquisitive, curious about what could possibly happen and what the next steps of, evolution or whatever you want to call this sort of stuff that's happening here. She's like primed to be the perfect perspective for a reader to view all of this through, because she's able to break it down, and that makes it so fascinating. And it feels more grounded in real science too, which I'm a fan of, which, it's just expertly done.
Yeah, and then I like how, Luke, you mentioned that, in the movie she cheats on her husband, but here she doesn't cheat on him, and yet she will leave during the night to go to this parking lot to look at, like, it's kind of an overgrown parking lot, and there's like this tide pool that has grown. And she goes and just spends hours looking at this tide pool, and she doesn't tell him where she's going, and she just wants to keep it to herself. And so it's interesting because it is when she's in Area X and infected by Area X, like, is it her or is it the influence or is it both? But the way she is able to have more empathy and understanding of her husband, and also see the ways that maybe she wasn't the best either, and it wasn't all his fault. And again, there's another quote I want to read, and it says, "Slowly, painfully, I realized what I had been reading from the very first words of his journal. My husband had had an inner life that went beyond his gregarious exterior, and if I had known enough to let him inside my guard, I might have understood this fact. Except I hadn't, of course. I had let tidal pools and fungi that could devour plastic inside my guard, but not him. Of all the aspects of the journal, this ate at me the most. He had created his share of our problems by pushing me too hard, by wanting too much, by trying to see something in me that didn't exist. But I could have met him part way and retained my sovereignty, and now it was too late." And so now to get into the tower. So like I say in the summary, when they were training to go into Area X, they made it seem like, oh, the lighthouse, like that's the big thing. But in the book, it turns out that the tower is actually what they wanted to investigate, and they purposefully didn't tell them about the tower. And so they just happen upon it. And then the words on the wall are so interesting because, like, they don't make any sense really. It almost sounds like biblical, but then if you try to make sense of what it's saying, it kind of doesn't make sense, which we do learn about the creation of the tunnel and the crawler in the third book. So I want to avoid spoilers, but it's this life form taking over this part of the world, and it's mimicking parts of the human world and the natural world, and it creates these doppelgangers. And so it's like the words on the wall are kind of its own way of mimicking humans as well, like this mutated version, just like the doppelgangers are mutated versions of the humans. And then also the way it's described, which again, we talked about how Jeff Vandermeer is great at things that are just indescribable, right? And the way he describes the crawler, it's like something that we can't even fathom. And the biologist, like, her eyes can't even like get a grip on what it even is. And then also the way the tower, once she's not hypnotized, the walls are like flesh, and it feels like going down the gullet of a beast.
One of my favorite parts about the crawler and the fact, just to touch on that she can't look at it, is it's like there's some symbiosis seemingly going on with a lot of the stuff in Area X, to where like I feel like because she was exposed to something she may, and we haven't read on, by the way, I don't want to speak for Luke, but I'm pretty sure neither of us have read on in the Southern Reach trilogy. I would love to read more. We kind of were waiting to see if there was going to be any more from the films. I don't think there is at this point, but I like to think that like there's some level of her not being able to perceive or look at this thing because of the spores infecting her, in addition to the fact that it's like this thing that seems otherworldly in a lot of ways, and like it would be indescribable. And in the same way, the way that she views the tunnel as a tower and like going into it is like into the belly of a beast. Like I wonder how the spores maybe affect your perception in a lot of ways, and like the senses that humans rely on, how like it affects those specific things and can kind of make you feel like you're in another world, which Area X very clearly is.
I love that he sets up all of these things, and even as you were both talking, I'm like finding myself agreeing with you, but then also there's moments in the text that like undercut what you like are asserting. The idea that like the Southern Reach purposefully has lied about the existence of the tower, aka the tunnel, that does seem likely. And yet there are times where she's like, maybe they didn't even know about it, and it's not on any of the maps. I don't know how new it is. Has it been here all along? Has it been here the whole time, or is it a recent occurrence? We don't know any of that. And like, yeah, the crawler, the nature of the crawler is so strange. Why is it writing the text? I agree, it seems to be like a refraction and reflection of the humanity that it's interacting with. We know by the end there's the revelation that at the heart of it there seems to be this lighthouse keeper, who's the original lighthouse keeper, who has like been preserved in a way by this symbiotic relationship with the crawler. But what the crawler even is, there's like multiple like creatures that attached to it and like orbiting the lighthouse keeper, and how much control or lack of control is going on in this situation is completely unknown. And then yeah, the interaction with the biologist herself, in some ways the fact that she has been infected by the spore doors also makes her not a threat. It seems like she might have been killed if she hadn't been, but it's like the crawler recognizes itself in her, and that's especially true when she goes all the way down and comes back, because at that point I think she's like fully become one with Area X. She's even glowing in the book. Like, she's literally has this brightness she talks about, and people talk about how she has like a phosphorescence to her skin. The psychologist says that she's like a flame when she sees her walking up later. I love all of that. And like the idea of the tower, I was thinking about this time, it's like, why is it a tower? Why does she like insist on perceiving it that way? Well, in the really trippy end where she goes all the way down to the bottom of this tunnel, there's like a weird door that she can't approach, and as she gets closer to it, it like pulls away. She's blacking out repeatedly when she sees the crawler, so like time gets really distorted. We have no idea how long she's been down there. She has no idea. And then she just turns around and comes back up as if she never reaches the bottom, but then it seems like she did reach something. It's so hard to like believe anything you're reading, and instead you're left to like fill in the blanks and try and figure out between the lines what's happening. And he uses the written word to do that, and that's I think best expressed by this run-on bizarre sentence that the crawler is writing. This is a thing that like of course isn't in the movie, because it wouldn't have worked in a movie in the way that it does in a book, where you're reading the words and the effect of the strangeness is on the page. And then even all of that is sort of framed by the fact that we're reading a journal by her, and so all of her mind state and all of her sort of altered thoughts is the filter in which we're perceiving Area X. So everything is unreliable. Not just the narrator, but just like everything is unreliable. It sounds crazy, but like it works so well.
Yeah.
You mentioning the journals reminded me of something I wanted to talk about, which is just this idea of all of it is a framing device that we're viewing this from. All these journals that we read along the way are in-world texts that, like you said, they're going to give you different looks at what possibly is happening. But I was thinking a lot about like Jeff Vandermeer being a writer too, and this idea that like of all the things that are being consumed and changed and everything in Area X, one of the things that is being regurgitated but not changed in any way are these journals, seemingly, as far as we know, and like how like these texts are what people are leaving behind for others to find, and how like the written word and texts are kind of like all we can leave, because nature consumes all after that. You know, like whatever we do to this earth, nature could, if say human race goes away, reconsume everything. And whereas like the text, the written word, like if someone found something like that, it's still like the ideas carry on. And I just felt like Jeff Vandermeer is doing something there with the journals in some way.
And even that, once again, is undercut by the book itself, because there's a 16-foot tall, 12-foot wide pile of journals that gets found in the lighthouse, which is like one of the coolest moments of the book, and I have chills every time I read it. And yet it's described that all the journals at the bottom are already moldering and being destroyed by Area X and like reabsorbed, right? So even the written word, although I agree it does have this lasting effect, and she's able to read them, it's already being lost, so nothing is permanent.
Yeah. Another thing that I love about this story is the what nature intends to do typically is to reproduce and survive. That's like the base level of what most things in nature. Human beings are kind of an outlier, and there are a few other species, but most things, the priority is reproduce and survive. And in seeing how all of this that goes on could come down to ultimately survival or reproduction, and you see that with like the copying mechanisms, the things that Area X is doing to replicate in a lot of ways or multiply, and like what spins out of that, and how like the commentary that's there is like, no matter how alien the nature may be, ultimately like these are like fundamental things within our universe that are seemingly like the through line of life. It kind of takes some of the horror elements that I love in this story, which are horror elements, but it shows them as really it's not on either end of the spectrum of horrific or, you know, cheerful and a good thing. It's really just like a baseline of this is what the world is, this is what the universe is. In seeing Jeff Vandermeer like sort of thread that throughout, it kind of recontextualized a lot of the entity and like maybe possible motivations and like what it's doing here, the way that it's changing and assimilating.
Yeah. And there's so much to get into with this book, and we could just make an episode just about the book, but we're going to move on to the movie. And so to go over the movie plot for those who have not seen the movie, by the way, throughout the course of this video, if you have any thoughts about anything that we are talking about, be sure and comment. That way we can continue the discussion on Annihilation, Area X, The Shimmer, down below in the comments. But for those who have not watched the movie, or maybe it's been a while and you forgot some of the details, to go over the plot, so we do get everybody's names here, and the biologist is named named Lena. And her husband is in the military. She also had been in the military, but he is on some kind of mission, but it's very mysterious. And then one day he shows up again, but he has no information. He can't tell her where he's been or what has happened. And then he ends up kind of like having a seizure. And so an ambulance takes him away, but then the ambulance is overtaken by these black SUVs, which then take him and Lena, and she awakes inside this facility, which we find out is the Southern Reach. And so she is in the Area X Southern Reach headquarters, and she finds out that her husband had been part of an expedition that went into the Shimmer. In the movie, they call it the Shimmer. In the book, it was Area X, but he volunteered to go into the Shimmer. And so now there's a new group that will be going in soon, and Lena decides that she wants to be part of this new expedition. My hair is kind of a mess today. I'm sorry. It looks pretty bad. But anyway, she decides she wants to volunteer to go into the Shimmer with the next expedition because her husband is now in a coma and dying. And so she wants to go in there in order to try to help him and make sense of what is happening to him. By the way, in the book, she knew her husband was going into Area X. It wasn't this secret thing. Whereas, yeah, in the movie, she had no idea where he was. But in the movie, we do learn more details about all of these women and their reasons for wanting to go into the Shimmer, which kind of seems like a suicide mission in some sense. And 3 of them end up dying throughout the course of their journey in the Shimmer, and we are left with just the psychologist and the biologist. And the psychologist had gone on ahead to the lighthouse. There is no tower or crawler in the movie. It's just the lighthouse. And so the psychologist is already at the lighthouse. The biologist is a bit behind, but then when she catches up and gets to the lighthouse, she sees a video camera set up, and when she watches it, she sees there are 2 versions of her husband, and one of them commits suicide with a grenade while the other one is there watching. And then she goes down into the bottom of the lighthouse and she sees the psychologist there, and the psychologist ends up being taken over by this alien entity, and then she kind of explodes from it, and it becomes this like strange alien life form. And while Lena is staring into it, it takes part of her blood, and then it transforms into this like alien version of her, and it is trying to duplicate her essentially. And so while this creature is becoming her duplicate, she then grabs one of the grenades that her husband had, and she gives it to her duplicate, causes it to explode along with the lighthouse. And it seems like this explosion also causes the Shimmer to be destroyed, because when she returns to the headquarters and they tell her that, you know, the Shimmer, the border wall, no longer exists, and so it seems like she has destroyed it. And then she goes to see her husband, who had awoken once this explosion happens, and now he seems fine. And so the 2 of them are reunited, but we see that even if the Shimmer is destroyed, so to speak, it still lives inside them, because we see in their eyes that even if Lena is the real version of Lena, she still has been infected with the Shimmer, and so it still exists within her. And then we know that her husband, it is the doppelganger version of him, and that is how the movie ends. So you already talked about how self-destruction is a big theme of the movie. And in this, like I talk about in the summary, we get the backstory into each of these women and why they are going. And it's called the Shimmer here. And all of them have these self-destructing habits. And then at the end, when Lena puts the grenade in the alien self, and then that destructs, and then the tattoo they get where it's a snake eating itself, also that self-destruction. So yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that theme specifically that's going on.
So upon rewatching this and rereading, to me it really stood out that Alex Garland, director of the film, and the one who adapted the screenplay, I believe, was very interested in this idea of self-destruction. And to him, Area X and its transformation that occurs results in a destruction of self. It changes us, and I think he recognizes the change that the book is describing. But his read on that was that it is ultimately an act of destruction. But that's different, I think, than the book, where annihilation is actually a trigger word that the psychologist has tried to use as a lever of control over the other people in the expedition. Annihilation instead in the movie is something that the psychologist says right before she is sort of destroyed and absorbed by the alien entity itself. And that recontextualizes that moment for me, because I think Vandermeer, and I know he has some mixed feelings about this adaptation. To me, his book was a lot more about transformation and how even as you transform and what is left can in many ways be unrecognizable, that he designed this biologist to be a character who still sees that as a good thing, or at least a net neutral thing.
Yeah.
Like, she's okay with it. Yeah. And so to me, like, it's just a slightly different focus, and it makes the movie in some ways feel darker or like the sort of conclusions it draws are a little more upsetting. And yet I also think it's a little more simplified to look at it that way as an act of self-destruction, and how we all have self-destructive tendencies, right? And we see that in the character, we see it with the biologist cheating on her husband. Yeah, it's an interesting shift. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on that. Am I right on that?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. In our coverage, we talked years ago now about Alex Garland, I believe, read the book one time and then chose to go into the adaptation process with sort of a vague memory. And that's such a cool way to approach an adaptation, because it does this weird transformation thing that the characters are going through in this book. It's like dreamlike and surreal, and the way that it changes, it feels like organically like going into Garland's own direction. So I applaud him for taking that on, and I still love this film, but just for very different reasons than I love the book. The movie does feel fairly bleak, and it feels like the intent was always to sort of figure out how to stop Area X in the movie. In the book, it felt like there's some sense of is this possibly not a bad thing? Is this some form of like next stage in evolution? And like it's seen as a bad thing because it's seen as change, and change can be terrifying in the metaphorical sense and in the physical sense. And clearly, like, it's not like this is like some alien entity that has our best interests at heart, but it's also not like here to just totally annihilate the humans or anything like that. It's just a force of nature. So yeah, I just think the film goes off and tries to tell a different story than the book. Both, again, I love both of these. They both have their merits, but I do think on revisiting both of these, it's very interesting how like I feel like there's something much more abstract in the book that I'm reacting to, and here in the film it definitely like concretely comes down in a few strong directions.
Yeah, and the relationship with her husband is very different too. And in the movie, she goes into the shimmer because like it's all for her husband, because he's, in a coma from having returned from the shimmer. And so he is the reason she's going into that. Whereas in the book, that was more complex too, because he like maybe is part of the reason, but ultimately like she's just doing it for herself because she just wants to experience this. And then it's not until she's in it that then, like we've talked about, where then she does feel a connection to her husband, and then he does become more of a driving force with her to some extent as the story goes on. And so yeah, here I think again it is maybe a more simplified view of her motivations of I just want to save my husband, so I'm going to go in here and see what it's all about. But then also with the self-destruction, cancer is such a big part of this movie. Like we're constantly getting cancer references. And so, clearly whatever is causing the shimmer, it is a negative thing, and it's like this cancerous thing that is taking over this area and changing it in a negative way. But then I do like how when she's being interviewed, they say something like, I think she says it felt like a dream, and they're like, oh, like a nightmare. And she was like, not all the time, because it could be, so beautiful too. And so visually, just this film was just amazing because there are parts that are just so gorgeous, but then obviously there's so many things that are just like so weird. And when they go to her husband, like his expedition, when they go to where they had like set up headquarters and the body where it had gotten all weird in the swimming pool.
It's interesting because you talk about that whole cancer reality in the movie, and I feel like that's this extended metaphor, and how Area X in many ways does represent a cancer on the earth and on life. And yet cancer itself, and maybe a simplified understanding of it, is this idea of like cells that refuse to die, and then they start to multiplicate and to duplicate themselves, and they're like invasive into your body. And we're presented with the idea that like that's what this is kind of doing. That is different than the book a little bit, where I think that is mentioned at one point, but it's just as like an array of many things that are like this, and maybe it's kind of like cancer, but maybe it's completely not. And I think Alex Garland really latched onto that idea of like this duplication ends up being destructive. And I totally agree that I think that's kind of the focus here. And because of that, it is terrifying. Even if you look at like death as like a natural thing in life and like all of that, it still has a negative sort of connotation, and it's frightening. And then yeah, the choice at the end to have that fire seem to destroy the shimmer, whether or not it actually does, it feels like this is one of multiple occurrences where Alex Garland was trying to make a more digestible film for audiences. And so I think it is darkly ironic that this movie was sort of cut off at the knees by the studio as it came out, and they pushed it. It was in a very limited run. I was lucky enough to see it in the theater, and it was actually one of my favorite movie-going experiences I think I've ever had. It's definitely up there, especially that final sequence where she goes into the lighthouse, and everything that occurs from there on. Absolutely love seeing that on the big screen, this amazing score, and I felt like it was so transportative, and I was just caught up in it. And then when I rewatched this recently, I watched it on my small screen at home, and I just felt like this is still good, but like I missed that experience of the big screen and the sound even, it made me like sort of mourn the fact that this movie was pushed to Netflix immediately and the vast majority of people never saw it in the theater. And it was because some focus groups reportedly thought that the movie was too cerebral, too weird. They didn't really get it. And then the studio execs kind of panicked and said, oh, it's not going to make enough money in the theater runs. Even though I see little artifacts throughout the movie where I think Alex Garland was desperately trying to take this weird, otherwise kind of art house film and make it somewhat palatable for a major audience. And I kind of wish he hadn't done some of those things because ultimately it didn't get you anywhere. And if I were to point any little criticisms at this movie, it's often those moments where it felt like it was a little bit simplified. It was a little bit hand-holdy. And even though I agree, I also really like this movie, it's so funny to me that it seems like he tried as best he could, and then yet it wasn't enough.
Yeah, I want to gush about the visuals because Laura mentioned those. I think that this movie, it looks incredible. The color palette that they used and the way that they like you mentioned, Laura, the sort of expansion of the body with the fungal little tendrils coming out and stuff in the swimming pool. Unbelievable image. And like we got like the screaming bear that's horrific and has stuck with me for years. We have the way that they shot this movie, like there's some level of like prismatic effects that they're using to really like have these like glints of light throughout, and it really sells the shimmer as like something otherworldly, and there's a sheen on it as well. It kind of makes it look like everything glowing some. So just, I thought visually really well put together. So much of this film, like I think of the humanoid looking plants too, like that's such striking visuals, and it gives you such a sense of immersion and such a sense of wonder in a space. In a book that's very environment heavy, they sold me on the environment, and I was like, man, this is so cool and so awesome. To talk about what Luke was talking about a little bit, I think like in taking some of those broadening measures, he's now working with like A24 and making sort of like really art house type films, or seemingly more art house type films. And it is so interesting to think of like a pre-pandemic time period where they're like, really worried about the theatrical run and everything like that. It's like, man, today they'd be ecstatic to get, I'm sure, the theatrical run that it had. And that's a great point, Luke. Like champion everybody go out and see movies in the theaters because it is a different experience. Like, it's always going to be a different experience. You'll hang on to those memories and it changes. You're just able to focus in and the soundscape and everything about it. I mentioned before, like, I'm from Florida. Jeff Vandermeer lives in Florida. Luke is from Florida. He now lives in Portland. I thought they did a pretty good job of representing like sort of the marshes and then sort of more of the prairie areas and a lot of like the differences in like there's just like lush forests and things like that. And then we get like bears and alligators and all the dangerous things that people talk about with Florida, and they're like gunning down a crazy possible shark gator hybrid or whatever. Some of those elements, like to talk about like broadening, like I felt like they tried to play up the cool here. And don't get me wrong, I thought just to talk about performances and cast in general, this is a crazy cast, but then they're playing up this like you're a super cool badass scientist who knows how to use a gun. Like I found that to be like okay, so we're trying to cater to like a lot of different demos here versus like I was like already sold on a biologist being super fucking cool going into this zone,
Yeah, and then one thing I wanted to say about the group of these women, because like I said, we hear their backstories. And then I was noticing how the way they die, it kind of represents like what caused them to want to enter the shimmer in the first place. But I just wanted to share my thoughts on each of them and how they die. So we have Shepherd, and she is the one mourning the loss of her daughter, and how she also says how she lost who she had been. And so she's kind of haunted by her past. And then she's killed by this bear thing, but then the bear returns and it has her voice. And so kind of like her past was haunting her, and now she still isn't officially dead, and now like she's haunting the people that are still left. And then Anya is the one who is sober, and the reason she's sober, that means she has no self-control. She is the one that kind of freaks out, and she loses control of herself, and she ties them all up and goes kind of crazy, and then she ends up getting killed also by the bear. But she gets killed by the bear again because she doesn't have any self-control. And then Jody is the one who does self-harm. This behavior can be seen as maybe in a way just giving in, and that is what happens to her, where she's like, you know what, I don't want to fight it. I just want to accept what is happening in Area X, and she just lets it take over herself. And then obviously Ventress, the psychologist, she has cancer when she went into Area X, and that's why she wanted to go in. And then, like we talked about how the shimmer is cancerous, and so then it kind of overtakes her in a weird way, the way her cancer would have overtaken her had she stayed in the real world. So yeah, I just thought that was interesting. Also with Tessa Thompson, the one when she's taken over by the plants, and how here in the Shimmer, you know, in the book, all of the creatures had once been humans that are now becoming part animal, whereas here the animals, like, they're not necessarily part human, but it's just kind of they're a mix of the plant life and the animal life, and then the humans can also get mixed in there too. And so that was also an interesting change and a different interpretation of what happens within the Shimmer / Area X.
Yeah, I would love to talk about what goes on. One of the most fascinating things to me in this story is this idea of like you can choose to give in to or you can fight it. Like that's like out and out said. There's really a few ways you can go about dealing with it. And it seems that you can make a conscious decision to give in and then have it overtake you all at once. And I find that to be such an interesting bit of what goes on near the end with Natalie Portman's biologist character, because she's fighting, but then there's also like a sense of assimilation. So she's like, it's like a sliding scale. Like you have Tessa Thompson's character, and it seems like Jason Leigh's character, they seem to rapidly give over. Whereas, of course, there's some ambiguity here, but in my interpretation, Natalie Portman's biologist character is like a slow build into possibly an acceptance or a giving into the space. And I just, again, I think that through line of like of giving over to nature in some way, there's some conservationist like sort of motifs going on, I think, there, as far as like we can coexist, we can slowly integrate and do what's best for both the area and ourselves. And I don't know, maybe it's because I find myself to be quite a supporter of conservation efforts, but like I interpret a lot of that from both the book and the film, and here seeing like Tessa Thompson give over to it, I'm like, there's some sense of me that's like, there's something beautiful about that. There's something that's like, you're becoming something larger than yourself, and we are very insignificant when you look at like all of nature as a whole.
In some ways it feels like she represents more of the feeling of the book, where it's like she's kind of neutral about it and she just kind of gives in and like embraces the transformation. Although they all do that to some extent, I think it's just her attitude about it feels more in line with the book. I want to talk a little bit about some of the, like, because you know you touched a lot on the visuals, James. There's a couple things that stood out to me this most recent watch where I was noticing certain recurring visuals and like frames within frames and stuff like that, where we were seeing, like, there's this shot where the camera's inside the jaws of the alligator shark hybrid, and how that's sort of mirrored several times in later scenes where the camera is down the hole that's in the bottom of the lighthouse and looking out at the biologist. And every time she's sort of like at the precipice, and then she goes in, she reaches in, she like travels inward. And it's about her like approach to that. And then finally at the end with this like wild, kaleidoscope alien thing that's happening, we get that shot within that looking out at her, and we see her eyes aglow and she's drawn to it, right? I love the way that Garland was able to reflect those scenes kind of with each other. And then the other thing was like the whole lighthouse sequence begins with this really pretty stunning wide shot of the beach. So far we've had so many like close-ups of all the characters. All of a sudden she goes to the beach and we get this stunning like really wide shot of her on this shimmering beach, and she starts walking, and she's tiny on the frame, right? And she's walking among these like crystalline shards and trees that have like grown out of the beach. She approaches the lighthouse and we see it and it looks stunning, and there's these bones just scattered around in front of it, but actually organized in a strange way and stacked upon each other. And that was a moment that to me evoked a lot of like, if you like that moment in the film and you're like, what happened there? Why is that the thing? And like, it's that weird sense of like something more is happening that we're not being shared with. Like, that's the feeling of the book. I was like, that moment feels the most like the book of anything. And like, especially the lighthouse in the book is filled with that stuff where there's like all this evidence of like past battles that have occurred. There's references as she's reading one of the journals to all kinds of things coming from the sea and how they are like under siege from the sea. And none of that's ever explained. And yet she goes to the sea at the end and you're like, but what's filling the sea? Because if you could imagine the Shimmer extending into the underwater area, like there's probably some really wild stuff going on down there too. It's all so cool, and I love that Garland was able to convey a lot of that just through his shot selection and through just little moments and little images. And even though you don't get maybe as much as the book, there was at least like a nod to it.
Yeah, I love a sense of like, don't explain everything to me. Like, have some texture in the world that we aren't privy to, and we can kind of extrapolate out and interpret and kind of debate what we think that might be. I also, that stuff with the bones, I'm like, man, that's so cool. And these like crystalline trees, all of that is awesome. You mentioned some of the recurring visuals, and the one that I want to talk about is the refraction of the through the glass of water, and like how that's so smart because you get this like inverse feeling, which is like in some way mirroring some of the doppelganger stuff that we're getting later in the film. And it's really cool because I think that that's typically within this film a sign that everything's not what it seems. This person may not be who they think they are, and then that leads to this final shot of Natalie Portman's biologist picking up the glass, drinking from it, and then seeing through it. There's this kind of shot where we see her hands, and the hand is coming from the opposite direction due to like the inversion from the water refraction. And I just think that that's like such a cool way to use like our world, physics in our world, and the things that happen that are kind of, when you look at it on the surface, feel like alien and weird, and then you know, blending that into the story. That's the one that stands out to me on this viewing for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And then to talk about the ending before then moving on to our book versus movie discussion, when she goes down into the lighthouse and this alien thing, it tries to recreate her, because we see how, like in the book, this thing creates doppelgangers of these people. And yeah, kind of like I was saying in the book, how it tries to mimic humans or tries to mimic nature. And so it is creating like a mimic of her, and how it literally mimics her, right? Like it's moving the way she's moving.
Yeah, and then she falls on the ground, it falls at the same time. And then when she goes to get up, their backs are to each other. So it's not like it's looking and mimicking what she's doing, but it's actually like somehow moving in the exact same rhythm without looking or perceiving.
Well, it doesn't
happening.
have eyes anyway.
Yeah,
so
yes,
if it's
true.
seeing her, we don't know how it's seeing her.
That is true, yeah. But I think that to me, that signals like there's a connection here that's undeniable now. That's not just like, oh, I'm going to mimic and learn what you're doing, as some alien entities may do. Like there's something like borderline biological and like down to a level we don't understand of this now being her. And then yeah, everything that goes on with the grenade and then on from there, the kind of reveal of the way that she hugs her husband at the end, and neither of them are possibly who they thought they were originally at the beginning of the story, and their eyes do that weird thing.
She uses that connection as her method of getting it to kill itself, right? She uses that like mirroring to hand it the grenade and to pull the pin and to like back away and hold it, and she like backs away so that it does too, right? And so she's using that mirroring to her benefit to sort of defeat this thing at the end. And I do think that the movie undercuts that with its messaging and kind of says like, maybe it wasn't defeated, maybe it's you know, maybe you can't defeat it. But
well, I think it's because
ostensibly,
I think it's possibly because it's become a part of her. As I said, like there's some symbiosis in Area X where like maybe just the spores getting in her have turned her slowly into some satellite piece of this entity.
And that's like, to me, more of a nod towards the book. Whereas ultimately, if you kind of reduce it to its base parts, what happened at the end here? She came up against the entity, fought it and destroyed it in a sense, and brought down the entire infestation. And then at the end, we get a classic It Lives ending where it's like, oh, maybe it's not fully dead, it's still here. And that reduces it to a very identifiable horror movie like format. Even as I think this goes far beyond that, that's one of the areas where I felt like the movie had simplified things in a way to make it recognizable and digestible to audience goers.
Yeah, and that ending too, you know how she gets out of Area X and clearly, or the shimmer or whatever, but clearly it has survived in both of them. There was a part in the book when the psychologist tells her that the border is expanding and Area X is growing, but then the biologist is like, over time, she's like, I think it's not as simple as that, right? Because for one, her husband's expedition, they all got out and ultimately they were returned to Southern Reach, but still she's like, how many other things have gotten out of Area X? So I don't think it's as concrete as like, oh, the border and what's in the border. And so the movie ending kind of reminded me of that, how it's not as simple as like, here's the line and it all stays on their side, we stay on our side. And how it is seeping through.
Yeah, and whether they got out or their duplicates all got out is unclear, right? Because at one point they see their entire expedition walking around doing stuff as doppelganger.
Yeah, and so it was in the book and in the movie, I would say too, it seems like it's pretty clear that with her husband's expedition and like with her husband specifically, the husband himself stays in Area X, right? And it's the doppelganger who is out in the world, because in the book, in his journal, he says that he is going to sail out into the ocean. So in both cases, I think it's the replicate as far as he goes.
That's also an example of what I was saying before, as you were highlighting it, where the husband in the book travels out into the sea and maybe to another island. I think is the implication there, might be somewhere else he's going. But how Garland interpreted that as self-destruction, because instead the husband burns himself alive with this phosphorus grenade or whatever. And again, that represents that slight difference of the transformation in the book is more neutral. The transformation in the movie is perceived as a destruction of self.
Yeah, definitely.
I
Yeah,
would like to see a new adaptation of this. As much as I like this film, in the book they don't even say it's definitely alien. Like, it
yeah,
could be another dimension, it could be something from within the Earth itself. Like, it's unclear where this
yeah,
came from. Whereas in the movie, it's like, oh, it's an alien, because it shows
yeah.
like a
At the
basically something
beginning,
hitting
at the
in
beginning,
sky.
I that was something that I'm like, man, you are kind of limiting and putting parameters on the story in that way, and I love some ambiguity in my storytelling.
It's one of those moments where it felt like he wanted to say, like, okay, this is going to be a really weird experience and you're not going to know what's happening, but I'm going to give you some breadcrumbs that are big enough to where you can get a sense of what's happening.
Yeah, I agree. I love the ambiguity of the book of just not, we get no information on what caused Area X to happen. And that mystery is also what caused me to want to read the rest of the books. And so I think Vandermeer, I love Annihilation on its own and how so much is unknown. And yet at the same time, it also benefits Vandermeer, right? Because I'm sure that aspect kept readers reading the rest of the books because they want the answers. And while in the third book, we do get some answers, Vandermeer, again, one of the reasons I love him is because he doesn't tell you every little thing. And a lot is up to you to just kind of figure out on your own to make sense of. But to wrap things up, I feel like as far as Luke is concerned, I definitely know which one you're going to say when it comes to book versus movie. But I really do love this movie. And I think when I see it, especially just on its own, like if I went into this not having read the book, even having read the book, I still love the movie. But the book, some of the things I loved about it, like I said, were the more human aspects, like the biologist and her husband. And the way it ends too, I thought was just so beautiful, which I did write down this quote as well from the very end. So I'll just share this real quick. After reading the journal, I was left with the comfort of that essential recurring image of my husband putting out to sea in a boat he had rebuilt, out through the crashing surf to the calm just beyond, of him following the coastline north, alone, seeking in that experience the joy of small moments remembered from happier days. It made me fiercely proud of him. It showed resolve. It showed bravery. It bound me to him in a more intimate way than we had ever seemed to have while we were together. And so in the movie, she is with a version of her husband in the end, but yeah, there was something lacking as far as that relationship goes. And so even while Garland, he captured the weirdness and the bizarre world so well, and visually it was just incredible, and it was so unsettling while also being beautiful, and the acting was fantastic. And so I do really love this movie, but when you're comparing it with the book, I do prefer the book too, because I feel like it just has, like I said, like it's sci-fi horror, but then it's just so much more too. So I would say the book wins on my end. What about you guys?
Yeah, I'll keep it pretty short here. I find so much to enjoy in this adaptation, and this is one of those things where sometimes you take a swing and it works really well. And what's crazy is I do think this works really well. As a reinterpretation, I think his vision to kind of go in with only one dreamlike reading of the book is it's so smart and inspired. I mean, just seeing it brought to life in this way, seeing the Shimmer Area X and seeing like Natalie Portman lead this as the biologist, she fits that so well. She so well embodies like a very capable and well-educated character like this, and then can also in the same breath, like all those emotional beats are so resonant. Like you understand why she would want to go into the scenario, and all the interaction that they have, that she and Oscar Isaacs, like the husband character, share together feel very genuine. For the visuals, for the performances, for all the horror elements and the cool color palette that they used, I love this film, but it just doesn't quite hold up to what the book does for me, and this really cemented it for me. Like watching the movie again, I was always curious. I think this will be my third time watching it. My second time reading the book, it just completely cemented the fact that like I personally haven't read many books like this, and the idea of like there being some level of horror to nature, definitely, but this gets into like the weird and the abstract and the interpretive more than many other stories that I've read in that way. And I would be so fascinated to know what Jeff Vandermeer had up his sleeve for future novels. So I definitely will be reading them at some point.
Yeah. All right. I'll weigh in. I've been fairly critical at times of the movie, but I want to reiterate that I do really like this movie. That moment in the theater with the alien interaction I was so taken in. I absolutely love that moment. It's one of my favorites from going to a theater, I think. The bear in this film, which is not present in the book, is one of the like most heart-pounding, terrifying moments, and the reveal that the voice they're hearing is actually this twisted monster that has stolen the like final moments of this person's life and is now mimicking it and using it to hunt others. Like, it's so dark and twisted, and I absolutely love that. There's so much to like in this movie. It is different. To me, I've highlighted that I think this movie is much more about self-destruction and transformation leading to destruction. That's a perfectly legitimate story to tell, and I think he does it really well. I just personally slightly prefer the more neutral look at transformation that the book shows us, even as there are plenty of dark things happening. And you could argue the self is being destroyed in the book. It's just not viewed as a negative thing. And I like that. In fact, it's almost unsettling in a very different way, because it asks us to be okay with it. It asks us to be okay with change in such a way that seems to destroy. That's such a big ask, but I absolutely love it. And to me, this book is a bit of a magic trick in the sense that it feels like it contains so much, even as it's such a small package, easily read. I highly recommend people check out the book, and I will also be taking the book ultimately. I think it's one of my favorite novels, honestly. It is rocketing up my rankings.
Yeah. It's so fantastic. And I'm so glad I had you on, both of you, for this episode because, which again, to shout out Ink to Film, like, you always have such great analysis and insight into things. And so I highly recommend people check out their channel. I will link to it down below. They're getting close to 1,000, so definitely go over and subscribe, get them to 1,000 subscribers. And yeah, I'm so glad we're able to talk about this one.
Thank you so much for having us on, Laura. We absolutely love your channel. We've been watching it grow over the years. I always check out your videos. They're awesome. So thank you for having us on. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, and thanks for the kind words as well. We were inspired to start doing video because we had you on and we talked. One of our first episodes with video for YouTube was actually with you. So thanks for inspiring us to do that and continuing to help us grow.
Yeah, and it's always fun collaborating. And thank you to everyone who is watching. If you have any thoughts, comment down below how you interpret the book and the movie, which one you prefer. Yeah, comment your thoughts down below, like and subscribe if you have not already. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time. Bye.